We just count down 3 and we'll go.
Yes, we are online, so we can start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Hello, I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation. I welcome you this afternoon, this evening, wherever you may be watching. This afternoon, we'll have a retrospective on the NATO summit, accomplishments and missed opportunities. All our panelists are not online yet, but they're coming, but I'll introduce them. Online is General Phil Breedlove, U.S. Air Force retired former Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. Coming on will be Ambassador Kurt Volker, former ambassador to NATO, Deborah Kagan, who's held numerous highly held positions in the Departments of Defense and State on national security issues. Nico Lang, former Chief of Staff for the German Minister of Defense and a senior fellow at the Munich Security Conference, who is in Wisconsin and on the periphery of the Republican Convention. And hopefully, or possibly, Ian Brzezinski will join us, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for NATO. Ian is in Latvia and moving around, and it was likely when we set this up that he would be able to connect, but his schedule is being changed, so we don't know. But if he comes aboard, we'll call on him. Having said that, we'll get started. And Nico, why don't we start with you? You were here in Washington throughout the summit and certainly are familiar with many of the players involved. How would you describe the outcome, accomplishments, missed opportunities, the role of Germany? The microphone is yours.
Well, thank you, Bob, for the invitation and for the possibility. And my summary of the NATO summit, especially regarding all questions concerning Ukraine, is it was the expected disappointment. The Biden administration made clear very early on that they are not ready to push the needle on Ukraine, and that this is more a summit about reassuring NATO itself and about celebrations of 75 years of NATO. So there was a lot about the past, a little bit about the present, but there was almost nothing about the future in the summit, and that includes Ukraine, which is, I think, an avoidance of one of the most important strategic questions, because I am personally convinced that peace for Ukraine and peace for Europe is only achievable if Ukraine will become a member of NATO. And as long as this question is not answered, there is no path to peace. The second point, there were some decisions made. All of that was known before, but it's good that they are in place now that can be implemented to help Ukraine, which is a high-level special representative of NATO being posted to Ukraine on a permanent basis now, a joint training center that will be established in Poland. I mean, those two elements can help maybe to improve the military assistance to Ukraine that will now be organized through a 3-star command, transforming the US-led operation in Wiesbaden in Germany now into a NATO operation to help with the military assistance of Ukraine. I say this all can help Ukraine because I think much of it depends on the implementation. But it's a possibility there. And the last point I want to make, for 16 years now, NATO has made the same decision about Ukraine over and over again. It is Ukraine will become member of NATO, but we are not ready to move ahead and not ready to clarify when and how this will work concretely. I think this puts Ukraine in a very inconvenient spot. It exposes Ukraine to have it in this waiting loop for NATO. I think it was an open secret that the US government and the German government, like in Vilnius, were the two governments blocking the developments. So as we will have elections in the US and elections in Germany next year, I think the question to me is how to work with the US government, with the German government to remove this blockade and to move on NATO. Like in Vilnius, there was a little bit of progress made in a separate track, which is the track of bilateral security assistance agreements that Ukraine concluded now with a group of countries, and maybe we'll conclude with more, because I think the G7 declaration in Vilnius and the Ukraine Compact ceremony in Washington was something that was helping Ukraine to, at least communicatively, overcome the unsatisfactory results of the NATO summit itself.
Well, I can't disagree with any of that. But well, why don't Kurt? You've been at the table, so to speak, at NATO meetings and have been involved very directly in addressing Putin's war in Ukraine. What's your assessment of the 75th anniversary summit?
Yeah, well, very, very similar assessment to Nico. I would maybe just pay one respect to NATO, which is that one thing the summit showed is that for the 32 allies, NATO still is important for their own security, that they band together to make sure that the NATO members themselves are not attacked. That's good. But we have a situation where we now have the largest war in Europe since World War II, and we don't have a strategy for ending it. And ending it depends upon defeating Putin's forces in Ukraine. We don't have a strategy for that. We didn't even really talk about it because, as Nico said, we set the bar for what the summit would achieve very low and some time ago, and without any real effort to address the war. So we made a few modest steps on Ukraine, but nothing significant. And my bottom line is that when NATO leaders came to Washington, they had two questions that they needed to address. One is, what's the strategy for winning the war? And two, what's going to be the future of US leadership? And when they left Washington 3 or 4 days later, they still had the same two questions.
Yes. Deborah, since Putin first invaded Ukraine, there have been a lot of announcements, including during the summit, concerning support for Ukraine. Such and such is being shipped, such and such is being pledged, and so forth. But often, actual movement of what's being promised or announced seems to take forever. Will the pledges made during this summit, do you think, be any different?
It depends on the equipment, and sorry to join late, but there's two things that I would raise. There is a handful of equipment that gets announced and it's ready to move very quickly. That's been the case with 150 millimeter ammunition, artillery, that sort of thing. That's moving very quickly. The air defense batteries that were announced, I don't want to go into details, but let's just say that will not be a slow roll. And I'm not going to say whether I'm going to do, as General Breedlove will understand, a neither confirm nor deny on this one, which is whether they're there already. Not my call to announce that. But I do think certain things are moving very quickly. I think the issue is and remains that there is still a fundamental lack of understanding on the parts of some people in the United States and elsewhere in NATO and other of our allies and partners at how quickly the equipment gets used and how quickly it gets used up. And there's still this fundamental misunderstanding that you're in a war 24/7, and there seems to be this difficulty in grasping how much burn rates go through. We saw this early on, but it's still a problem. It's still a problem with countries understanding that when you fire an air defense system, you fire an interceptor, you fire a missile. Those missiles have to be replaced once you fire them. a lot of the batteries, air defense batteries that were in Europe, and I'm not just including Patriots here, but the IRIS-T and the SAM-T and the like, all had, lower numbers of total interceptors because they were never used. They were there as a prophylactic, a deterrent strategy, and they were never used. And so sometimes it seems like it's an epiphany that if you actually use these systems a lot, you're going to need new missiles, new interceptors, not necessarily new launchers, not necessarily new target acquisition, but you're going to need new missiles. And I think, systemically, industry is now trying to meet those needs, but this isn't going to be easy because you're talking about a huge supply line function. You're talking about workers for that line and the like. I see General Breedlove piping up here, so I'm going to hush.
That was not my intention, Deborah. Sorry about that. I just wanted a two-finger intervention to pile on to what you said, because I'm in agreement with everything you said. And Bob, for our audience, who may or may not have a lot of tactical experiences, the result of these varying timelines and the result of these varying burn rates and the worry that they may be caught once again in a hiatus on deliveries changes the tactics of the Ukrainian military on the ground. If they are unsure of delivery dates, or if they'll have another hiatus, they will change the way that they employ the weapons and the amount of weapons they employ and what types of targets that they would hit. And may I just say that this sub-optimizes Ukraine's ability to defend themselves on the ground. Deborah, go take over again. I didn't want to interrupt.
Just to expound a bit on what the general said. I mean, he understands this better than anyone else here, which is that when you're doing your strategic planning, when you're doing your day-to-day tactical planning, you have to know what's available to you before you can make those decisions. And if you're not sure on what's available, it makes it very hard to not only implement, but plan for those decisions even 36 hours out. So that's an issue. Like I said, I think there's a fundamental change, both in the US and in Europe, in terms of understanding the need for this. And there's some selfishness here. This is not all altruistic, because they understand this is for their own defense as well. And they've been found lacking on production levels and the like. And I think that's changing. Our hope is that it changed more like that cigarette drug running boat as opposed to an aircraft carrier. It needs to move quickly on top of the waves, and not, these long, treacherous, terrible timelines that you do this. So I think that's a sort of a longish answer to your question, Bob.
Well, thank you. Well, General Breedlove, I'll come back to you with this. I'll ask you this question. What was the message, or what message do you think Vladimir Putin got from the summit?
So let me use as a basis to give you that answer some things that were already said. I really love the words that Nico put together when he said this was an expected disappointment. So we lived up to the expectations that were fed to us ahead of time, that there was going to be no movement on the larger status of Ukraine vis-a-vis NATO. And so I think what the main message that Mr. Putin gets is, I continue to have them deterred, press forward per my current plan. Mr. Putin's most successful weapon to this date is his war of intimidation, his use of words surrounding nuclear activities, surrounding expansion of the conflict activities. All of these words are very effective in Western capitals and are very effective at limiting Western responses. So I believe that Much like for almost 2 decades, we went through this same process with Georgia, where every year we came up with a new set of words and adjectives. We are sort of stuck in the same paradigm with Ukraine. And until we make a concrete step to begin some process, I think Mr. Putin's going to be very happy with these kinds of outcomes. Now, having said all of that, which is very negative, let me just say that there were some very good decisions taken by the nations about what they're going to do to help Ukraine. With all the caveats which Deborah so correctly laid out about deliveries, consumption rates, timelines, etc., there is more work to do. But if anyone has something to have mild celebration over, it's the Ukraine military, because this was a productive, I think, conference in the main for them. But we fell short. And again, as Nico said, we reached an expected disappointment. I agree with him.
Nico, you've been quoted here a couple of times. Do you agree with all this? And your perspective on the European countries, I suppose, especially Germany, and what they took out of this, and what we might see from them coming out of the summit.
Yeah. I can only underline a point that has been made by Deborah. I think when we look into the next months and maybe the next year, where the likelihood is higher that especially the European partners of Ukraine have to supply more and have to supply it faster, I think we are not in all categories of production lines. We are at the speed that we need to be. And I think that is also a message I think Putin is taking away, because I think he is counting very carefully what is produced, how much of it is produced, how fast can it be produced. And we see this with air defense systems and with ammunition for air defense systems, but we also see it in other dimensions. If you see how excruciatingly slow European manufacturers are when it comes to armored vehicles and battle tanks. So that is, I think, something the Europeans have to be more active in expanding the production capabilities. And there's one point where I wish that progress would have been made, but unfortunately it has not been made. There have been some conversations in Washington around this issue, but no decisions made. And that is the question of forward logistics and bringing maintenance and repair, especially to the armored vehicles, closer to the front lines. I think that's very important now for the sustainability of the Ukrainian war effort. And the Ukrainians themselves, they have a lot of possibilities. They have qualified personnel, they are machine builders, they had good arms industry before. But to have joint ventures, to have investment, to bring contractors in, I think that is the next step we need to enable the Ukrainians to have a sustainable war effort. And one last point, it has been said implicitly, but I just want to make it explicit one time. I think the reaction of the US government, but then of everybody, not lifting the restrictions for deep strikes further than the bordering areas of Kharkiv Oblast after a children's hospital has been hit with a missile, I think that was a sign of weakness and is understood as those by the Ukrainians and also by the Russians.
Kurt, the other day I heard you say a few things on this too. Would you want to add to that?
No, I think we've covered all of this ground here about what's expected and where things are. In terms of first off, steps. I think we need to be taking steps that send a signal to Putin that we're serious. Right now, everything we've done is, as has been said, is predictable. It's disappointing. It's substance. I mean, we are providing air defense systems. We are providing ammunition. There's lots of things flowing, but it's without the clear sense of message and purpose. And I think that's what we need to do. And so some of the steps that we could take that would do that, we could dramatically step up our direct engagement in air defense for Ukraine. I heard somebody argue yesterday that, well, the issue is the number of systems and the number of interceptors, not whether they're being used from NATO territory or whether they're just being given to Ukraine. But the symbolism of NATO providing some air coverage over Western Ukraine and Southwestern Ukraine would be hugely important if we were to do that. So that's a step that we could take. Participation in freedom of navigation operations in the Black Sea and help with demining. This is another thing that would be, not necessarily a game changer anymore. Ukraine has already opened up the Western Black Sea and is able to ship, but the presence of NATO vessels going in and out of the Black Sea and ensuring there's no piracy and just conducting point-to-point freedom of navigation operations. That again would be symbolically very, very important. And then, as we talked about earlier, the invitation to Ukraine to begin accession talks. We underperformed on this again at the Washington summit, making that statement that not only are we doing this, but we envision an end to the war. And we envision that Ukraine is a member of NATO and that NATO is providing Article 5 collective defense commitment to the territories that Ukraine holds from that moment. That would be a very powerful symbol as well. So we've got to start thinking about how we get it into Putin's head that he has to be thinking about how to end the war. Right now, Putin is thinking he can keep going.
Well, I think that's been a problem for 10 years. How do we get something in Putin's head that says we're serious? We're not going to let it happen when so much has already happened. General Breedlove, you've talked about that any number of times, that we don't have a strategy. We are doing things, but we don't have. If we had a clear and decisive strategy, certain things would flow from that. Is that a correct reading of what you've said?
I have said that, and may I just do a precursor to that, piling on the ambassador's remarks, because I always agree with Kurt. He's way smarter than me. The bottom line is, in our war colleges, Bob, you've heard me talk about this before. In our war colleges, we study the old dead guys, the Clausewitz, the Jomini's, and Sun Tzu. And they say it always in their own way, not in these exact words, but a couple of things they all say. And one of them is that you should deter your enemy and not allow your enemy to deter you. The other thing they say is you should seize and hold the initiative. And in baseball parlance, we're 0 for 2 in this regard. Mr. Putin has the initiative. We are reacting always to Mr. Putin. And to the point you just made, we should be taking actions that forces Mr. Putin to react to us, to worry about what we're doing, as opposed to vice versa. And as we talked about before, in the current policy situation, our policies are deterred. We have acknowledged and are acting on our concerns about Mr. Putin's nuclear words and his expand the war words, and that we take policy decisions which are hard to understand. We have celebrated that we're allowing Ukraine to fire into certain limited parts of Russia with our kit, when Russia is firing into Ukraine from nearly 300 degrees around the globe, around the compass, with kit from North Korea, Iran, possibly even China. And we still are not fully embracing the idea that Ukraine can fire back at all military targets in the target set. And, these are things where we are deterred, where our being deterred is costing the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people greatly.
Well, you know, the deterrence, and especially in ability allowing Ukraine to fire into Russia and so forth, has been a big issue for quite some time here in Washington, and it's one in Europe as well. Nico, do you see any change taking place there that would allow a greater flexibility on Ukraine and how it uses the weapons?
No, I think the case has to be made over and over again. My impression was that when the recent Russian offensive into Kharkiv Oblast started and the discussion on lifting the restrictions got into a new round, some of the decision makers unfortunately looked at the map for the first time. And that's very frustrating. More than 2 years into a war, that we have political decision makers who are reluctant to look into the map, look into the details of the military situation, ask themselves what is necessary from a military point of view. And I think that's the fundament, at least in Germany, where I'm from, that's the fundamental problem, that the main decision makers, especially the Chancellor's office, they still believe they can debate the war somewhere, and that political decisions will shape the war. But I think we have understood the war is shaping the politics here, and they are reluctant to draw the conclusions. I do not know how to influence that, but I know that public discussions, pressure from the outside, pressure from international partners, and Ukrainian battlefield successes, they always have contributed to decisions taken one step further. I'm afraid we cannot spare the German government another round of discussions about Taurus cruise missiles and about deep strike capabilities and about lifting the restrictions. And we have to, I think, continue the discussion until the decision makers are moving. But it's frustrating that we very often, also from a German point of view, but I think it's also true for the US, we do the right thing, but we do it at a very late moment in time. And the situation would be much better if we would have done it more timely.
Yes, well, I mean, I think that's everybody here has talked about in the past how it's been very slow from the very outset, from 2014. Everything that's been done has been slow and often too little, too late. I mean, it gets there and it's used. And one of the things that Friends of Ukraine Network have talked about long ago is we used to get the excuses from the United States that, oh, we're not going to give them that because they won't know how to use it, you know. And then once they have said no 4 times and use it, the record is that the Ukrainians are very adaptable with the equipment. Deborah, I mean, you've followed that very closely, and it seems to me that you can't give the Ukrainians anything they can't figure out how to use, and maybe use even better than the people giving it to them.
Yeah, well, I want to address a couple of things that were raised by my colleagues here. The first is on Nico's comment on putting more people in country to do stuff. The United States made a decision, not very widely broadcast, about a month and a half, 2 months ago, that it was going to up the numbers of defense contractors as part of the Office of Defense Cooperation. Other countries have already done this. They're not very vocal about it. They already have people on the ground. I think there has to be a conversation about not just the broader piece at Wiesbaden. I think there has to be a conversation about, can there be a Wiesbaden East with the countries that have already agreed to up their numbers of contractors in country that can work in the rear echelon of Ukraine to help facilitate a much more speedy and expeditious way of repairing equipment, maintaining equipment, and making recommendations and suggestions, sort of a right seat, left seat mentoring process. So I think that needs to be addressed, and it's not being addressed. And unfortunately, it was not being addressed as part of the larger Wiesbaden picture that was announced at the summit. 2, on FOUN in the Black Sea. Kurt, love ya, but you forgot to mention the bull in the China shop here, the one thing that's sticking out, which is Erdogan. And Erdogan has a very shall I say, creative view of how to interpret Montreux and the allowance of ships that have anything to do with, can even loosely be described as military, even if they're not, and their entry through the Bosporus and how they can perform in that region. And you have special exemptions, obviously, if you're a Black Sea nation. That's how Romania was able to get 2 mine clearance vessels through there after months and months of negotiating. And the Turks have turned back other things. So I think a more serious conversation has to be had with Erdogan. I think the new demining agreement that was signed between Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey is a good start, but it's only a start. It's only a piece of the picture. But that conversation, members of NATO have been reluctant to have that conversation with Turkey. I think at some point you just have to have that conversation. The third point is on this use of weapons. Look, Ukraine's talented. They study STEM in the 7th and 8th grade. They know how to use weapons. A lot of stuff's being done virtually. They learn very quickly. Not really an issue, although, I mean, there are still some very stubborn people who think that their own personal experiences in using the equipment in Iraq and Afghanistan will also happen to Ukraine. But there's a vast difference between taking someone who can read an engineering schematic and someone who is a 17 or 18-year-old graduate of high school. So I think we're imprinting too much on that. I also wanted to briefly touch on this caveat issue. I want to say that there are a significant number of nations who have given equipment to Ukraine that have no red lines at all, none. And many of them are members of NATO, and many of them have no red lines. And they have never told Ukraine that they cannot use their weapons to strike whatever they need to strike in Russia. They consider this legitimate under Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is to be able to attack the belligerents' means of prosecuting war, and that means both energy, oil, gas, etc., and weapons and airfields from where these things are being launched. So I want to say that Germany and the U.S., with a handful of other countries, tend to be the outliers on this. Like I said, there's a significant number of countries, they don't broadcast it, who have absolutely no red lines at all in the use of their weapon systems. And I think that's positive, and they've been like that from day one. And then the last point I want to make is because General Breedlove raised the other countries. I think there's one thing we have done just strategically wrong. It's like a blunder. We've allowed the narrative of supporting Ukraine to be an either-or construct of Europe or the Indo-Pacific. And, to me, it's one team here, one fight. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran are the enemy. And even if you in your fantasy don't want to believe there's people in the US administration like this, that they're their enemy, you just listen to them talk, because the enemy gets a vote and they consider us their enemy. Russia's military industrial complex does not work without significant Chinese input from everything from heavy machinery to chips. It just doesn't work. It can't produce. So you can throw people at a problem, but you don't have the equipment to throw at the problem without China. We know what North Korea is doing. We know what Iran's doing. We know that Iran and Russia have had this condominium of efforts in the Middle East and the East Med and the Levant for decades. That has not gone away. And that is a constant threat to, freedom of navigation and everything else in that part of the world. And we've seen what's happened in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandab. And that doesn't happen without significant Russian, Chinese, and Iranian cooperation. I'm sorry, we just have to say it. So we've allowed what I think is a misnomer, a dichotomy of allowing this argument to be an either-or construct. It's one and the same, and those 4 countries see it as one and the same. And we need to respect our enemies to understand that when they say we're the target, we're the target.
I think that's pretty straightforward. Kurt, I may have missed this, but it looked like you were about to say something or comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Erdogan because, Deborah's right that he has a particular view, but Erdogan's in the marketplace and we're not. I think that's we should be going there and saying this is what we want to do. We want you to be in a leadership position. We want to support you as the biggest NATO ally in the Black Sea. But work a deal with him. But we're not doing that, so it's easy for him to then just play hard to get.
Did we lose General No, General Breedlove is there. Wanted to ask you, I mean, this issue has been around, at least in the Friends of Ukraine network, since 2017, and there's more and more talk and promises and maybe movement. F-16s. What do we think we're going to see, and when do we think we're going to see it?
So there's lots of speculation right now. What is in the public sector is that they are moving towards Ukraine. Like Deborah, I'm not going to break news or confirm nor deny, locations or anything like that. But if I had anything to say about F-16s now, it was long before 2017. US EUCOM back in 2012 and 13 did a study with Ukraine and pointed out the needs for air defense and what that would take. And we didn't talk about quote unquote F-16s, but that report did talk about fourth generation aircraft. So long before 2017, there was discussions of what would be needed to make the Ukrainian Air Force capable of doing more defense of its own airspace. So that has been a long time. Here's the caution that I would put out there. And this is going to sound hurtful, but at this point, the F-16 for Ukraine is more about a future capability than a today capability. It's going to take time to build the number of aircraft and to build the number of pilots required to fly those aircraft that will truly make a difference on the battlefield. Yes, a small number of F-16s will make some local differences as they begin to arrive in Ukraine. But to say that the F-16 is going to make a big difference right off the bat is bad. It is not appropriate, nor is it true. They will have to build to probably at least squadron size, if not 2 squadron size, before they become more than a tactical anomaly on the battlefield. And so we need to, one, temper our own expectations, but more importantly, support the Ukrainians as they make those decisions, which I believe they will, that will preserve their assets while they build. Because if they just throw everything they have into the fight right off the bat, this could go badly and badly quickly. And so I believe the Ukrainians, as they did with their own Air Force at the beginning of this fight, they will work to preserve the asset as they grow the capability. And I would just like to close with just a chuckle. I was answering questions with a bunch of airmen on a Air Force show we were doing about air power in Ukraine. And I was asked a question about how long did it take before I felt like I was an expert in the F-16. I flew it for over half of my 39-year career. And I told the folks that I was pretty good with it in 3 or 4 years, and I was probably not as good as I thought I was at about 7 or 8 years. It was really up around 10 years that I felt like an absolute expert in the airplane, and I was an instructor in all of its missions and so forth. And so the guy said, well, that's a long time. How long does it take to get 10 years experience in an F-16? I said, it takes 10 years to get 10 years experience in an F-16. We're not going to wave a magic wand and have an Air Force that has 10 years experience. So we need to be careful of our expectations. We need to support Ukraine in the decisions it will make, and we need to encourage them to carefully manage these assets as they grow the capability. And this will be, at some time, a great capability for Ukraine. And as importantly, it will be the beginning of the Air Force next that will protect Ukraine long into the future.
Very interesting. When I made the reference to 2017, Phil, I was talking about the Friends of Ukraine network urging our government to start training Ukrainian pilots on the F-16. Nico, do you see any? I suppose I've asked this, but do you see any genuine movement from outliers or hesitant, I'm not just talking about Germany, countries in Europe to I mean, the American leadership, as I think it was Kurt that said, we started this summit with one of the questions was American leadership, and when the summit was over, it was still a question. What kind of leadership are we seeing, or can we expect from Europe without the leadership of America involved?
Let me say that with all critique that I share on my government in Germany, I think we have to be fair that by stating that Germany has moved very far from the ridiculous 5,000 helmets into delivering equipment and weapons and ammunition that make a difference for Ukraine on the battlefield. And Germany is a very significant contributor to the Ukrainian war effort now. The significance of Germany will remain high, especially with regard to the question that you just posed, going into the election season in the US and the post-election phase in the US, where there are many uncertainties, as always with elections. But I think it's worth paying attention also to developments in Europe, where I have the feeling that politically, the relative importance of Italy has been growing recently. And Italy is one of the countries underperforming when it comes to helping Ukraine. It's also a country that has industrial capabilities. And bringing Italy, France, Spain more up to speed with the Scandinavian and Central Eastern European country, I think is an effort that is very much necessary to have more European unity, but also to have stronger support for Ukraine. I think the president of Ukraine and the Ukrainian leadership will also pay attention to this, working more with Italy, France, Spain, and others in the months going forward. And maybe one other aspect that we did not talk about yet, but that I found very interesting at the NATO summit is, among the countries close bilateral security assistance agreements with Ukraine, there is, I think, a very substantial agreement with Japan. And there was also a NATO P4 meeting in Washington, D.C., and Ukraine's work with Japan, possibly South Korea, Australia, Singapore, that could be adding a very interesting aspect to the support for two reasons. One, there are production capabilities when it comes to artillery ammunition that are already used from a South Korean point of view to support Ukraine. And there, I think, is more that could be tapped into by getting support from those countries. But the second, and maybe more important thing, Ukraine needs more help for investments, technology transfer, and components and parts for the Ukrainian industrial and technological effort. And if we are talking drones, if we are talking Ukrainian missile program, there are some components that you only can get from certain countries. And if you do not want to get, let's say, optics for drones from China, then you are talking Japan, South Korea, and others. So to tap into that potential also for Ukrainian arms industry could be one element of moving forward, especially because the European Union has a free trade agreement with South Korea that could be used to have a big market power to purchase components that could be used then for the Ukrainian industry. Maybe Ukraine can even go so far and say a certain amount of our own budget, but a certain amount also of the money everybody is contributing to Ukrainian military assistance has to go into Ukrainian industry now to build sustainable industrial capabilities in Ukraine.
Very interesting. Deborah, President Zelensky met, I believe, while he was in town with some American defense contractors. There's been a little about that. I haven't seen a lot. Do you know too much about what was discussed and whether there's some interest in joint ventures and so forth at this time, even though the war is going on?
So a couple of things. First, going back to what Nico just said, I think one of the most underreported aspects of the summit, which I think was huge, was the Indo-Pacific part of the summit. That was a significant meeting. It had significant outcomes. And I think there were, two of the countries involved had already been working with Ukraine on significant equipment. And I do think there is potential for more. And I think what it shows is how serious these countries, and remember, there were only 4 there, but if you add on to Philippines, Vietnam, others who were there, this is a recognition on their part that the threat from China is not separate from the threat from Russia. And so I emphasize that. I think Korean defense industry has been nothing short of spectacular because they were always facing a threat. They're living with it across the DMZ every day. And because of that, they've always been on sort of a wartime footing. And I think it was brilliant over a year ago when Poland signed this huge defense contracting with South Korea, because I think it set a fire underneath European and US defense contractors to understand that if you can't offer what we need, we're going to go to a country that can. And I think Korea showed how quickly it could produce and how quickly it could deliver. And that was pretty significant. So I think they're teaching a lesson to the rest of these defense industry people. So again, I'm glad Nico raised this because to me it was very underreported. The second part of this is, yes, there were a lot of meetings. There is interest, but I'm going to say 2 things here, and General Breedlove had sort of said, which is that you don't want Ukraine to go backwards, meaning Ukraine should not go back to the sort of heavy defense industry that it was doing before. Ukraine is never going to be able to compete with Rheinmetall or General Dynamics or Nexstar, with these very entrenched companies on a global market. So if Ukraine starts producing sort of IFVs, tanks, sort of heavy equipment like this, they're never going to be able to do this in a manner as efficient as some of these other companies can do that. That's not where they're going to make money. Where Ukraine will make money is with their intellectual property and their know-how. So the fact that they're very dynamic on electronic warfare, on drones, counter-drone technology, counter-air technology, that sort of thing. So those are things that Western industry writ large, not just US industry, is very interested in, because the advances Ukraine is making in this are unheralded. We can't make those advances by testing things out. General Breedlove will laugh when I say that at Fort Huachuca. It's not going to give you the same results. So this is even true on the naval assets, using naval strike missiles ground launched against the Russian fleet. So there are a host of things Ukraine can do that other countries aren't doing that makes them extremely competitive and can actually make money. What we should not be encouraging, and some were, and Ukraine should not be thinking about, is going back toward this heavy industry that will not make them money. It'll be a customer of one, meaning Ukraine, on that, and it's not where they want to go. But they can actually compete on a global market with a lot of these other things because of the advances they've made, because the modern battle space has an industrial revolution every couple of days now. And they understand that, and they know how to fit that, and that intellect and that know-how is what is marketable. So I will say that you can do certain things for industry in Ukraine. Things can be built there. There were some memorandums of understanding signed with Northrop Grumman and a small firm in Florida that, you know, will deliver lower caliber ammunition and the like, and some of that will happen inside Ukraine. But again, you're looking for some broad-based stuff, and you have to consider, if you're going to go invest in putting a production facility in Ukraine, you have to be able to defend it, because it becomes one more target. And so you have to be willing to have it be hardened. You have to know where to put it. You have to know how not to make it a target for Russia. So yeah, so those are a compendium of those issues.
Bert, you've talked about industry working in Ukraine, and I want to share some thoughts with that after Deborah's made some excellent points, but I know you've talked about it as well.
Yeah. Well, I think Deborah's points are very well taken. I agree with them. I think that Ukraine has some advantage in some new tech. Lightweight, non-metallic drones, AI combined with drones, small drones that you can put in swarms, and integration of these things. So you have both an intelligence picture and a delivery capability. Long-range drones, which they're now using to attack oil refinery and other facilities deep inside Russia. So there's a lot that they're good at. And I would like to see American industry partner with them and maybe help broaden that capability. What I see right now, unfortunately, is American defense industry is very complacent because they have expensive systems and large long-term contracts with the Pentagon that pay them a lot of money. So they don't have much incentive to change what they're doing, work with these startup Ukrainian companies in areas that they have not really done before, done in the same way. So unfortunately, I don't see the US companies doing that. It may be more Ukraine partnering with some smaller European countries that are going to find ways to create a more industrial capability for this new type of warfare. And I think countries like the US and others are going to have to start procuring this sort of stuff. It's not expensive, but we may have to have a multi-spectrum or a multi-layered capability given what we see happening on the battlefield right now. I've had a chance recently to meet with the minister in charge of strategic industries and some of the board members, Ukroboronprom. I think that they are focused now on getting serious about Ukrainian defense industry. They're trying to sort out the wheat and the chaff. They're trying to break it into pieces. They are thinking about strategic partnerships with Western companies, much more serious way than they were able to do before. There's a lot of waste and mismanagement in that system that they're aware of, and they're trying to fix that. So I think those are some of the main issues around the defense industry side. And then the other thing I would say, since we're bringing up business, is the vital importance of helping Ukraine's economy grow. Ukraine needs tax revenue. Ukraine needs energy. They need an economy if they're going to be successful at the end of this war. And I still don't think, despite the now 3 Ukraine recovery conferences we've had, I still don't think there's any Western strategy for how to do this yet. And I would love to see the West put somebody in charge as a former prime minister, former head of state, so that there is an ongoing focus on what's needed for Ukraine's economic development, and that person can then argue, cajole, problem solve, go around to capitals, G7, EU, NATO, etc., to push on getting decisions that are needed. There's a lot that could be done, but so far we've still been stuck in this mentality that we can't do much on the economy until after the war, which I think is wrong.
Well, thank you. We're coming to the end of our hour. We've discussed quite a bit, said quite a bit, but why don't we do a quote unquote lightning round? It doesn't have to be lightning, but a final round. And why don't we do the same order that we started with? Nico, things you want to add to catch? I mean, our title was Retrospective of the NATO Summit, Accomplishments and Missed Opportunities, or anything else you want to add to the conversation?
Maybe just 2 points, one on the front lines and one on the home front, if you want to call it like that, in Ukraine. On the front lines, I think unfortunately in the east of the country, Ukraine will be able only to delay for a period of time, losing village by village, town by town. But in the south, I think Ukraine still has a chance to put pressure on Crimea, to put pressure on the bridges, to create trouble for the Ukrainians. And I think to concentrate the effort of our help to give Ukraine the instruments to put pressure on the south, I think that increases Ukraine's position also in everything that is following. So that would be important. The second point on the home front, I think that's the most difficult part for the months to come. The energy situation is very bad in Ukraine. Even in places such as Kiev, there is electricity only for 3-4 hours per day. If this continues, it will be difficult to keep Ukraine afloat, to keep the businesses running, but it will also be likely that we will see a new wave of people leaving, at least for the winter. And I think we have to do as much as possible to get electricity to Ukraine and to keep the country afloat in the months to come. That's of crucial importance.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Great.
Completely agree. I'm glad that Nico brought up the energy sector, because that is critically important. We have got to get serious about that. There is still capacity, production, energy production capacity that can be mobilized and brought to Ukraine. And our international financial institutions, EBRD, European Investment Bank, IFC, they've got to make funds available on a short-term basis and work with the Ukrainian private sector, not only with the state-owned enterprises, in order to get production capacity up in Ukraine as quickly as possible. The other point I wanted to make, Nico, is in Milwaukee. This is a bit of advice for our European friends and allies. We already have former President Trump as the Republican nominee, J.D. Vance as the vice presidential nominee. And at this stage, you have to say a very high likelihood that he'll be reelected president. Europeans should not freak out, should not get emotional, should not start criticizing. They should be pragmatic. They should not make assumptions about what policy will be. They should do their own homework about what's needed and be prepared to do what they are capable of doing. And they should be proactive in engaging the United States about ways to move forward to bring an end to the war on Ukraine's terms, a victory for Ukraine. But don't sit back and complain. Do your own homework and be proactive. I think that is going to be a far more productive way going forward if we do have another Trump administration.
Thank you. Thank you, Kurt. Deborah?
I'm going to say my sarcastic Chicago expression about what Kirk just said is so much hand-wringing, so little time. Really, just enough of the hand-wringing, less of the whining and the whinging and whatever, and just, be pragmatic and handle it pragmatically, put some adults in the room and get that done. I will say one other very quick wrap-up, which is despite what Kurt said about industry, there is some U.S. industry on the ground in Ukraine, not just the recent MOUs, some smaller companies, some others who are doing things. There's some German companies there as well. Again, this is a not our place to sort of expose what they're doing and who they are. None of us want to be in a position of creating more target sets for the Russians. So we'll avoid that. But there are people doing and who understand what Ukraine brings to the table and how they can work with that. So I would say that, yes, there's issues within US industry, but there's also some people who are thinking much more futuristic about this and understanding what those capacities and capabilities are and how they can help development of our own industry as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Phil?
Well, I'd like to associate myself with Kurt's remarks. I think his laydown of how Europeans should move forward is exactly right. I've passed many of these same remarks as I've traveled Europe in the last 2 months, and I asked them just look at the last Trump administration, and Europe didn't fare so badly. Our troop presence grew, and et cetera, et cetera. And so I just want to associate with those. I think that we should think also about Crimea in a very different way now. I would like to take it just a small portion further than Nico took it, and that is, if we think we are going to have a president that is going to try to force everyone to the table, then I think we should take pretty drastic action now to change the arrangement on Crimea. Cutting off Crimea via cutting the land route, cutting off Crimea by further damaging the bridge, and then beginning to attack in detail all of the military targets on Crimea, so that the situation on the ground is very different if we go to some sort of a negotiation than it even is now. I would congratulate Ukraine on what they have already done to make Crimea a hard place for Russian forces. But I think we need to exponentially bring the pressure up in Crimea and give Mr. Putin a problem during negotiations.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. Going to the point that Kurt first brought up, well, Nico first brought up, it has been my comment that whatever anybody thinks about either the Trump administration, the Biden administration, a possible future Trump administration, or a future Biden administration, we are going to have to work with whoever is in the White House come January. And when I say we, I mean the Friends of Ukraine Network, those of us here, European countries, and our country as a whole. And our objective, at least in this overall conversation, is, I believe, can be stated as working toward protecting and advancing the United States' vital national security interest in having Ukraine free, independent, and strong. And we'll have to just keep working on that. We've been doing it for some time. We have to do it. We've got some great people here. Nico, I'm really happy that you were able to join us. Appreciated your being with us. Deborah, Kurt, Phil, as always. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day, evening, night, wherever you are. And Slava Ukraini.
Thanks.
Right.